while we talk about disambiguation and serialization disambiguation, in other words, into a system of measurement, and I talk about reducibility, it wasn't until we worked on epistemology the past couple of days that I understood I should connect reducibility and epistemology, and that those two things coming together sort of makes a whole new set of much better coherence across what we consider our epistemological spectrum, which consists of the disambiguation, the grammars. Then we have reducibility, decidability, testimony, reciprocity, and demonstrated interests. If you understand those basic tools, that's sort of like our geometry, so to speak, our list geometry. So is the reducibility, which I talk about all the time, but and I always just assume it's really obvious that disambiguation is great, but then there's a problem, your competing problem of reducibility, which basically means, for example, if you're a technical person, or even if you're not, you've heard about this thing called Google's new AI, or GPT-3 is one of them. And GPT-3 is one of those things that searches the whole internet, and you ask it a question, it goes out there and finds it. Well, the thing isn't smart, right? It's just looking for patterns in speech. And since there's so much speech, it can find a lot what's out there. Scott Adams did a test the other day, so it was very funny, is he ran one of a question against it and to see if it could produce a Dilbert cartoon that was actually understandable and funny, and it worked, of course, right? Because there's a consistency to the pattern of Dilbert cartoons, right? However, what's interesting is the context is about 2,500 words. So think about that, 2,500 words. That's basically the size of post I would write on Facebook that would make an argument. It takes about 4,000 words to 5,000 words to defend an argument. It takes about that's why Twitter is so successful. You can't make an argument or refute one. You can just spam each other with virtue signals. So the problem with 2,500 words is, think of that as your working memory. Is that context? I mean, in the context of a book, right, a narrative, you need more than 2,500 words of context in order to maintain context in whatever a question you ask. So the problem is your and my context is essentially whatever we've got in our lifespan, right? I mean, we can build contexts all over the place, and of course the machines can't, or they can't build context. And what GPT-3 doesn't build a context. Tesla driver AI does build a context. It builds an environmental context, right? That's why they know they can build a robot, is because once you have context, you can produce decidability within a context. But the problem with anything verbal is it's an unbounded it means basically an infinite context, right? And so the GPT-3 isn't building a scenario, right? It isn't building what we would call an episodic memory, which we would be able to organize into a series. The problem with reducibility is some things are not reducible. Like, can we reduce the universe to some basic fundamental laws? It looks like it. Well, looks like we're getting close there. Can you reduce human behavior to some basic fundamental first principles? Well, it turns out you can, right? But the problem is that some things aren't reducible without an extraordinary amount of context. And and we cover mathematical reducibility here. We cover computational reducibility. We cover simulation reducibility. And we cover adversarial competition reducibility, which is survival, evolutionary reducibility. And some things can't be expressed in math. They can be expressed in computation. Some things can't be expressed in computation. They can only be expressed in simulation. Some simulations can only be expressed. Some simulations require adversarial competition. In other words, evolutionary competition over time. And then we have to be able to say, okay, those are great things, but those are ways of setting some descriptions. But then how do we reduce that? Well, sometimes the only reduction is the whole fucking novel. You know what I mean? There's no reduction available other than an enormous story. So what happens with reducibility is there's a competition between the means of reducibility and the context sustainable by the human mind without a narrative tying the individual states together.
I want to introduce this premise of the sensorium as a reducible function, generating episodic memory as the reduced sensorium.
Correct. Perception, what we call perception,
Okay.
is an adversarial competition between neurons for correct prediction, resulting in a consistent and coherent model of the world, right? Which we call an episode.
So correspondence to episodic memory.
Right.
When the sensorium corresponds to the episodic memory, we know what to do.
Correct. And otherwise, there's no, until we can, that's what meaning means. So when you have an episodic memory, the thing is, what we do is we store the equivalent of spaces and places.
Yes.
Right. And so an episode is a space and a place. Now we have the ability to abstract this place and space into not just the space and place, but the other experiences we had in that space and place. In other words, everything is organized by this sort of contextual hierarchy that we have to produce in order to create something that's commensurable. So what we basically do is, it's sort of like a video game with rooms. You go into a video game and it has a room and you sort of can remember what's in the room, right? And then you remember what's in the next room. But you can remember how to get from one room to the other, right? So that's wayfinding. But what happens as we think more and more abstractly, right? We're generalizing experiences, and when we generalize, we can leave out certain attributes. So we can, in other words, that's what generalization means. It means is losing information and concentrating salient information that's consistent across different episodes. So when I say everything begins with movement, I'm not kidding.
Right. So it will be this as frog perception is related to motion only.
Yes, exactly. And
so it's not relevant. It's ignore that which does not move. That which moves may be visible or runnable from.
Right. And if there's a danger, then jump at whatever's darkest. Right. That's how a frog, or they're so simple, right? So my point is, you start out with movement and then we abstract away information, which is how we get to visualize abstract or think of more increasingly abstract things. But we start with what's called an episode, right? We eventually got to the point where we can now create episodes out of states of mind rather than states of physical presence.
Right.
And but it's the same function. Anyway, so my point was that some things are irreducible.
Right.
Right. In other words, the only thing you can do is tell the whole story. Right. And even then, some things like I'm trying to think of something, for example, some simulations or some adversarial competitions aren't reducible to anything other. Right. They're not meaningful. For example, let's put a whole bunch of things in competition with each other. If you run 1 million simulations, you will come out with some basic statistic. Right. But that's all it tells you. Right. The lions tend to eat the rabbits until there's an equilibrium between lions, rabbits, and grass. Right. I mean, not the lions, whatever, the wolves eat the rabbits.
Right.
There's so much information loss in that reduction. On the other hand, prediction. You can't say that at this particular geography, this right here, the rabbits are going to get eaten by the wolf. You can't tell. It's not reducible beyond the fact that over time an equilibrium will happen. Does that make sense? The individual states within the system aren't predictable. So in an economy, your behavior is not predictable in economy. It's only the mass of people in general whose behavior is generally predictable.
Right. So this, in my profession, it is the patient says, "Is this normal for this condition?" That is meaningless in
That's
this
a meaningless statement.
Right. I can't predict what's going to happen to you. I say you'll tell me before I know.
So reducibility is a very important part because it gets us away from the problem of, well, if it's not reducible to mathematical expression, it can't be scientific. That's just simply false. Not enough stuff is reducible to mathematics. I mean, right, mathematically reducible.
Right.
Right. A lot of phenomena in art. And so this is the problem with the math being the gold standard. I would argue computation is a gold standard, right? And not mathematics.
Mathematics is a proxy for computation.
Exactly. It's a shorthand.
And it's insufficient.
Well, yeah, you can't express everything in mathematics.
It represents a fragment of that which is computable.
Right. When you say are we making slow, steady progress? I'm like, I don't consider that slow, steady progress because it solves a fairly serious problem, at least for me in my job as an epistemologist, right? I mean, I have to be able to defend these things and give it. And when I look at something, I'm like, well, if somebody argued with me, I would give that answer. But that's different from me telling people in advance, you need to understand these concepts. So adding reducibility is something that's helped a lot, and it solves it's like that whole sequence, which is not intuitive at all, which is grammars, epistemology, reducibility, decidability, testimony, reciprocity, and demonstrated interest. So this is how we fix the problem of truth, is we separate decidability, which is right, and testimony. So we say, is it decidable? Is it testifiable? We get away from idealism. These are just performative actions. So we know something is decidable or not. We know that if is testifiable or not. We know if it is reciprocal or not, and we know if it is reciprocal on demonstrated interest or not. And so if we have all those criteria, we have all of human cognition in a very discrete set of tests, which is what grammar is being used, what epistemology, what epistemology does that deliver to us? What reducibility does that deliver to us? What decidability does that deliver to us? What is testifiable what's testifiable, what's reciprocal, and how do we test reciprocity, but by demonstrated interest? Now, the only thing we have to add to that is cooperation, which is what is cooperative, which is reciprocity. So we build up from cooperation and we get the ternary logic, right? Boycott. And that's all there fucking is to the universe. There's nothing else. It just
like that. I want to translate Kurt's language, his vernacular there. Dude, that's all there is. It's like, it means that
everything can be measured by that system of measurement.
There is no human experience that exists outside of that pattern.
Correct.
That's all, folks.
Yeah.